Hello and welcome to Integrating Victim Care and Law Enforcement Operations for Effective Mass Violence Response. What's in it for law enforcement? We are happy that you are here today. We have a great panel of experts who will be providing you with some information. My name is Dave Thomas. I'm a retired officer from the Montgomery County Police Department, which is located right outside of Washington, D.C. I am a former SWAT team member and hostage negotiator, and actually have been training law enforcement for 35 plus years. And this is some of the most fascinating training that I've seen in a while. I'm now going to pass things to Paige to do a brief bio of herself.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Paige Allmendinger. I come to this presentation after a career working in victim services. So I'm a social worker, and I've spent the past 10 plus years working with survivors of crime like domestic violence and sexual assault. And I come to this specific presentation after spending 3.5 years with the San Francisco District Attorney's Office on a project to integrate victim services into the city and county's mass violence response program. So very glad to be here with this panel group and looking forward to the presentation.
Hi, my name is Mitch Cunningham. I recently retired as Deputy Chief with the Wilmington Police Department. I've got over 36 years in law enforcement. I've managed several incidents where we've activated ICS. Currently, I'm the Chief Law Enforcement Advisor for the National Sheriff's Association. Very much looking forward to this training and the information that we'll be talking about.
This presentation is being brought to you by the ICP TTA program, which stands for Improving Community Preparedness to Assist Victims of Mass Violence or Domestic Terrorism Training and Technical Assistance Program. ICP TTA is just a shorter and easier way to say it. We have a couple of goals that the program focuses on. The first is to augment existing emergency response plans for mass violence to include victim care, care of victims, care of families, care of first responders. We find that most mass violence plans stop after a threat is neutralized and a scene is secured. However, following the incident, victims, their loved ones, and first responders have a number of physical, mental, emotional, financial, and informational needs. Our goal is to extend the planning process to anticipate and meet these needs. Once we have developed a plan, we also hope communities will exercise their plan and include the victim care pieces. So we are really focused on planning and making sure all the appropriate people are involved in the planning process. We want everyone who will be involved in a response at the table, so everyone knows what their role is and what resources are available to best assist victims and their families. Part of what you're going to hear today is there is not often a lot of planning that happens in a joint way between victim services, law enforcement, and emergency management responders. We hope to help you understand why it's important to change that. When it comes to the planning process, the ICP TTA identified 16 best practices that should be included in every mass violence plan. These best practices come from experience of subject matter experts who have done multiple responses over time in a variety of different settings. Each best practice defines a necessary component of an effective response to criminal mass violence and domestic terrorism incidents and is listed accordingly to the chronology of a response effort. And when plans encompass all 16 practices, we know that a community will be able to respond to victims in the way that the community needs to. With that in mind, our goal today is to look at providing the most efficient and effective care to victims following a mass violence event. As a law enforcement officer, I know what's expected of me in the performance of my duties. I've been provided with policies and procedures that establish protocols and give me guidance and help me to make the law keep its promise. I also know that victim services professionals are dedicated specialists who maintain a high level of expertise. Mass violence incidents, along with some of the other types of incidents, like human trafficking and sexual assault, are where our jobs collide. Without a common understanding of each other's work, capabilities, and limitations, there is bound to be a whole lot of chaos in the response, some repetition of services, and some things just fall through the cracks. So, what we are really looking for in this training is to help law enforcement understand the victim services piece and encourage joint training and planning so that when you show up at one of these instances, it's not the first time you've met the victim service providers in your area. And so you know how you can work together to best support the victims you're both there to serve. With that stated, I'm going to hand things back to Paige to provide some background information on victims and victim services.
So the first thing, in order to talk about how and why victim services is an essential part of responding to criminal mass violence events or domestic terrorism events, we want to make sure that you all have an understanding of who victim advocates are and what roles that they play. So the first question we want to make sure we're asking and answering is, who are victims of criminal mass violence and domestic terrorism? And when we talk about those folks who are considered victims for these types of events, it's often a decision that's made on the day of the event. And the decision is made by the key lead agencies. Those are often the lead law enforcement agency, the prosecutor, whether that's a district attorney or a state's attorney general, and the lead victim services agency. And the definition that they decide on that day is the definition that will hold true for all of the people that were impacted by mass violence events. And this is different and unique from how we typically think of how we identify victims. Most victims of crime are identified through police reports or from counselors or mental health practitioners. But for massive violence events, it's really that combination of those three key stakeholders who make that determination, and then the services. So who gets access to come to a family assistance center, who's going to have ongoing victim advocacy, and who's eligible for victims' compensation. All of those things will be determined by that definition that is determined that day of the event. So that's who we're thinking of when we talk about victims of crime for these types of events. So we next want to talk about who are victim advocates, where, and by where we mean organizationally, where are they located? What kinds of agencies do they work in? And what are the tasks that they do in their day-to-day jobs? And how are those tasks applicable to what they would be doing with victims if they responded alongside law enforcement to mass violence events? And really the question we're attempting to answer during this presentation is, why should law enforcement want to partner with victim services for these types of events? So who are victim services advocates? We'll talk about the different types of agencies that these advocates serve in, but the core things that hold true for all victim advocates, no matter whether they're working for nonprofits or government institutions, is that they are trained and they are experts in working with victims, witnesses of crime, and the loved ones who were also tangentially impacted by the crime that affected their loved one. And so this is the core of the day-to-day work that they're doing already, often with crime survivors like domestic violence victims, sexual assault victims. This is the work that they are specialists in doing. And the two roles that I think are incredibly important and applicable to this conversation that victim advocates play, the first is that they're aware of the resources that are available for victims of crime. There are lots of different services that are available for victims of crime, but unless you're really steeped in that world, it's really hard to navigate it and find those resources and apply for them and do all of the paperwork. So that's where victim advocates really play an essential role. The first resource that is incredibly important to all victims, but especially for mass violence, is victims' compensation. And if you're not familiar with victims' compensation, every state and territory has a victims' compensation program. And they do vary state to state in terms of what's covered and what's reimbursed and the allowances in terms of how much money they can assist with. But what those victim compensation programs do is they help pay for costs for things that the victim is experiencing because of the crime they experienced. So some common victims compensation coverage areas are folks can get either reimbursed for, or victims compensation can pay for things like medical bills. So if they had co-pays from their insurance that from the crime related injuries that they had, they can get assistance paying for those. If there's a short-term or long-term disability that's a result of the crime that they experienced, they can get assistance paying for medical devices. For folks who are victims of homicide or who are killed from criminal events, the families and loved ones can get help with funeral and burial services. They can get assistance paying for mental health counseling. There's a lot of resources available through state victim compensation programs, but they're really administratively hard to get sometimes. So they often require some kind of proof of victimization, like a document, a lot of application information. And so victim advocates are really skilled at helping victims of crime apply for those really necessary funds to help them start to heal from the crime they experienced. Another thing that they do day to day that's incredibly important for victims of mass violence and domestic terrorism is mental health resources. And so they have access to, whether it's nonprofit agencies that specialize in counseling services for crime victims, or they have lists of mental health counselors who are open to accepting and who are trained in working with people who've experienced trauma. They have really strong relationships and can help link crime victims to mental health counselors and support systems that can provide resources indefinitely into the future as those victims need support with mental health and counseling. And the last thing is that victim advocates are trained in crisis response and in emotional de-escalation. They are often working with folks in the immediate aftermath of crime, during the criminal legal process, like having to go to court and testify. And so they're really skilled at working with folks and helping them navigate whatever emotional response they're having to the victimization that they experienced. And so they can help them both with the literal tasks of helping connect them to resources, but really help with that emotional support piece too. And it's not just for the immediate aftermath. They can provide support in the immediate, the short term, and in the long term, because we know that the impact of a crime survivor isn't just the days and weeks following when the crime happened. It's really, for the duration, often for throughout folks' lifetimes, that they're dealing with the impact of the crime that they experience. And so victim advocates can work with them really along that entire spectrum of time that they need support and assistance. Next slide. So where are victim advocates located? Who are they in your community? How do you find them if you don't know who they are already? Different communities have different victim advocates in different places. And so you'll have to do a little bit of investigative work to figure out where the victim advocates are for your community. But these are the common places that you can find them. For government agencies, so some police departments, some law enforcement offices have their own victim advocates in-house, and often these are called victim assistance teams. And so some police departments have victim assistance folks that they can call upon on scene, when they respond out to incidences. So there may be internal folks within your department that are skilled in this kind of work. Prosecutors' offices are also where you can typically find victim advocates. These are often called victim witness assistance program specialists because they are both working with the direct victims as well as the witnesses who may be coming and participating as a part of the prosecution process. And so both of these, depending on your jurisdiction and your location, there may be victim witness folks in both the police department and the prosecutor's office, one or the other, but they're great institutional resources because regardless of which location they're located, they again have those tools, they have that information about what resources to connect victims to. A lot of communities have nonprofit-based victim advocates, and more often than not, we see them specializing in specific types of crime victimization. So you may know about sexual assault advocates or domestic violence advocates, human trafficking advocates, and nonprofits that serve those types of survivors. What we find is that there are a lot of those types of advocates, the skill sets, the resources that they have, even though it's really specific to those crime types, those skills are still applicable in mass violence response, and those advocates can still be called upon depending on what the needs are in your community and what other resources that you have to help support victims in the aftermath of mass victimization, even if that's not their day-to-day work. A lot of the same core principles and resources overlap, and so they could be great resources for you all as well. And the federal agencies, so the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, they all also have victim specialists that work in their departments. And so they are deployed when their agencies are the lead investigative agency, but they can also be called in and asked to support local mass violence response teams. So they all have advocates who are able to be called upon, even if their agency is not the lead investigative agency, their victim support specialists can come and support the needs of victims in your community if you call upon them. So a great additional resource that supplements the other advocates in your community. So day to day, victim advocates are not responding to mass violence, luckily, but it's important to know what their tasks are day to day and see what the applicability is if they were to respond to a mass violence event. So every day, victim advocates are doing things like providing crisis services. They're helping find emergency housing, whether that's shelter programs, whether that's short-term hotel stays. That's a core thing that happens for a lot of survivors, that they need somewhere to go because where they were staying isn't safe any longer. They're helping with other immediate needs, so food and clothing. A lot of crime survivors are displaced with literally just what's on their bodies at that time. And so they're really skilled at knowing where they can access immediate food and other toiletry resources that folks may need. Connection to mental health or counseling services, we discussed a bit earlier. Information about the criminal justice system. So most folks are not really, aside from maybe watching Law and Order SVU, that's kind of the context that they have for understanding the criminal legal system. And so victim advocates can really help folks understand what the process looks like and explain it to crime victims in a way that's understandable, that's not steeped in all the jargon that we use when you're in the system and you're doing it every day, but really help folks understand what's happening, why it's happening, who's involved in the criminal legal system, and what they might be able to expect in the future. They can also help with things like protective orders, whether that's a protective order that comes through the criminal case, if the case is being prosecuted, or civil protective orders that folks may need if the person who harmed them, to try and keep that person away from them and keep safety from them, be safe. And then again, we've mentioned crime victims compensation, so help applying for and help accessing victims compensation resources. And again, investigating within your own community, we talked about where you can find victim advocates. You also want to find out when they're working. So some victim advocacy organizations are 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They might have hotlines. They might have folks that deploy out into the community. Other victim services agencies work normal business hours. So Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. And you might have a constellation of both types of victim advocates in your community. So understanding, not just their roles, but when you could call upon them to get help is really essential and important when you're thinking through how to continue to build those relationships with those victim advocates. So what's in it for law enforcement? I've done a lot of training with law enforcement over the course of my career. And so one thing that we really want to talk about is why would you want to bring victim advocates in to respond to these types of events? So I'll just read the quote at the top. Mass violence and domestic terrorism incident response is already chaotic. I'm not sure if I would want to add victim services. Why would I? I think the first thing that is the most meaningful thing for law enforcement who are responding on site is that bringing in victim advocates really frees law enforcement up to really focus on the tactical operations rather than dealing with the interpersonal needs of the people who are impacted. What we know is if there aren't dedicated people on scene to respond to the needs that victims have, they might be not just acute medical care, but they might be in crisis, they might be crying, they might be displaced from their homes. These are all kind of social services related needs that law enforcement end up ad hoc stepping into if there's no one else there to support those victims and playing that role and connecting them to those resources. But if you have someone there specially trained and who has the tools and resources to work with those victims who are in crisis, then law enforcement can focus on really what their goal is, what the end game is for their role and what they're most skilled at on scene, which is that tactical operations piece. Extended victim care. So we've mentioned this before, and I think it's incredibly important, especially when we talk about mass violence response, is that advocates provide that one-on-one support then and there, which is great, and it frees law enforcement up so they can focus on the task that they have at hand. But it also gives them a point of contact, gives victims a point of contact for ongoing care beyond on scene at the incident. It's someone who either themselves or they can connect that victim to ongoing support that can work with them in the short term, in the long term, can really meet their ongoing needs as they're navigating the criminal legal system or finding and accessing additional social services to begin to heal from the victimization that they experienced. It also allows advocates who are really trained in maintaining those emotional boundaries to work with the victims. We all in our day-to-day lives, if someone's in need, most of us are stepping in to help when we can. But it can be really hard, especially all of us know that sometimes you bring the work home, sometimes you go above and beyond because you feel called to support this person who you see is incredibly vulnerable and has been hurt. And so victim advocates, because this is the core of their day-to-day work, they really had to train and become experts and really hold themselves accountable. And a core component of the work is understanding how to establish boundaries. So both making sure that the victims have the support they need, but as much as you can, trying to leave work at work and not carry it outside of the scope that you have within your role. And so we don't want, folks to be pulled into stuff that's not only not their work, but that they're going to then feel responsible for carrying on beyond the incident and feel like they have to be the kind of the emotional support person for those folks that they helped on scene. And then the last piece on the slide, so victims who are supported tend to be better witnesses and more willing to assist in the investigation. We know that is true. We know when folks get what they need in terms of being able to address the experience of being a crime victim and the needs that they have related to their victimization, then they can more wholly and fully participate in what's necessary for the criminal legal process. The last thing too that's not on this slide, but I think is worth mentioning is victim advocates not only organizationally, come with whatever team that they have at their organization. We're discussing there's a system of support intra-agency. There are also victim advocates that exist in larger regions and in states and communities. And so if there aren't enough victim advocates in your town or in your county, they often can call upon victim advocates in other communities to act as mutual aid and bring those victim advocates in who have the general same training, same expertise to provide that ongoing support, whether it's an event that has lots of folks like we saw in Las Vegas with the Route 91 shooting, where we had victim advocates from multiple states. We had Nevada, we had California, we had folks from all over coming in and providing support, or folks are burning out and you need to bring a second layer of victim advocates in to continue that support. They have communities, they have mutual aid networks that they can call upon to help with those responses, which is another huge asset for responding to these types of events. So now I want to introduce, you'll see some clips from a conversation that we had with Tim Murphy. Tim served in law enforcement for more than 30 years. He, during his time, worked in investigations. He worked in peer support as a motor officer, a field training officer, a SWAT officer, and he retired as a team commander. And I met Tim when I was at the district attorney's office in San Francisco because we worked together. He currently serves as the director of victim witness assistance in San Luis Obispo County in California. And given his really unique position with both experience in law enforcement and in victim services, Tim's going to share an example of what he knows now that he wished he knew when he was a law enforcement officer, that might have made his life a bit easier if he had had the resources and knowledge about what victim services could provide.
As you were asking that question, two events just jumped right to the front of my brain. And without going into details, just in generalities, one was a domestic violence incident where there were little kids present. There's almost hospitalization, almost transport, but not. Well, the victim refused, but either way, my partner and I spent, the suspect had jumped out the window and fled, and we couldn't find him. So we'd been there many, many, many times in the past. And, we worked very hard during those overnight hours with this victim who was very anti-law enforcement and all that. Just, I don't want to say, well, anyway, it was just that situation. And we worked very, very, very hard. And somehow we made it through that. And we were able to get a statement and get statements from the kids and the ones that were capable, and successfully get through that, complete a good investigation, and ultimately get a filing and arrest that guy later. That it would have been so much easier if I had somebody there who had a trauma-informed approach to working with victims, who could help me navigate through that, help me build those bridges in this moment, right? Because it was there again, that's not a hostile mass casualty incident, but it's a traumatic event. And, the people that are in there right at that moment are dealing with that, trying to muddle their way through it. And so I'm very proud of that one just because we made it through it. But looking back on it, oh my God, it would have been so much easier. And at that time, this was a long time ago. And back then, if you had a in that jurisdiction, sexual assault occurred, that was just at the beginning of when sexual assault advocates were being introduced into the equation. And unfortunately, and this is not pointing fingers or anything, but back then, the law enforcement relationship with the sexual assault advocates was not a good one. It was not good whatsoever. They were not DA based at that time in that county. They were doing a good job. They were doing what they were supposed to do. I definitely do not want to bash them, but it just was not a positive relationship with law enforcement. So we knew this, they wouldn't have come out for this event, but that was our thought about advocates, if that makes sense. So we took care of, we handled business and we got through it. So I wish I'd had a victim witness advocate there. And then another one where just a family, horrible family nightmare had occurred. And we had to deal with some, we had to work with this family who was there again, sort of anti-law enforcement, but understood the threat that was presented to them. Some wanted to work with us, some didn't. There were cultural issues. Definitely back then, law enforcement was not getting cultural competency training. And so, we just fought our way through that. I don't mean physically fought, but we worked our way through that. And there again, it would have just been, knowing what I know now, it would have been so much more efficient, but I don't mean that in a rush way. It just would have been better for us and for this family, for sure, to have had someone there who had a trauma-informed approach to things that we just didn't have as law enforcement. And that's not a bash on law enforcement either. That's not that time, that just wasn't standard at all.
Victim services will make things more difficult. They don't always give me the information that I ask for. So depending on the role and the agency that the victim services advocates in your community work in, they might have different rules and expectations around confidentiality and information sharing. And this, I know, can be frustrating for law enforcement when they need to get some information and they can't get it. Just know that those guidelines are different for victim services agencies as they are for law enforcement. Often the funding and the guidelines that rule over victim services agencies, they have limited ability to provide information without releases of information, and there's often more protections, and those are really put into place for the survivor's safety. And so part of what we're hoping that law enforcement offices across the country will start doing is start building those relationships with victim advocates so they can understand what those limitations are before they're responding to an event and having to try and navigate that when emotions are heightened, when we're in the midst of a crisis. So if you can start building relationships, if you can learn about each other's roles and rules and the policies that guide your work, that's going to help you when you respond on site, because you're going to have a better understanding of what to expect from the victim services folks that are responding alongside you. It'll also help you just in the short term and in long term build a stronger relationship. We're really talking about partnership between law enforcement and victim services in a mass violence and domestic terrorism context for this presentation. But I think that this relationship is important for the everyday work of both agencies. And so building these relationships will not only benefit you all if and you all have to respond to an incident like this, but will help in the day-to-day work and really helping make sure that that continuum of care for victims of crime happens across agencies and that you all are working well together. So what can victim advocates do in responding to mass violence response? The first is that they can help in staffing the centers that are stood up in response to mass victimization incidences. And so family reception centers or family notification centers are those centers that are established right in the immediate aftermath of an incident where you need folks to go to await information around loved ones, if it's their friends and family that are showing up, to provide immediate resources to folks. And so they can really help with the management and providing a lot of those core essential services at those family reception centers. They can provide that crisis and emotional support. They can bring in crisis counselors who are really skilled at working with folks in the immediate aftermath of a crime. Many communities have facility docs, which I don't know if you all have in your communities, but if you do, they're amazing resources, not just for victims, but also for first responders. We've seen a lot of folks that just facility docs really help with that immediate emotional need and can be an amazing asset if you don't have them in your community. It's great to look into. And they can help manage immediate needs. So like I said earlier, everyday victim advocates are helping connect folks to food resources and toiletry resources. Those are the same kind of things that folks may need in the aftermath of a mass violence event. So again, it's the same skills that are being transferred from their day-to-day work into this family reception center needs that victims will have on site. And they can also link potential witnesses to law enforcement for interviews. So what we know is that folks, might be showing up to the family reception centers. They might start disclosing facts of the case that they saw that maybe they haven't talked to anyone from law enforcement. So they can really act as a great liaison to help liaise with folks who may be witnesses or victims to the appropriate law enforcement folks to relay any important information. And so there are additional eyes and ears on scene for law enforcement as well. So family assistance centers, those are those longer term centers that are stood up for a few days or a few weeks after an event. They can do, again, this is kind of a core of what victim services work is. It's really those essential resources. So they can connect victims to those longer term services, whether that's a case management system, whether that's ongoing counseling services, helping them apply for victims' compensation. They can provide that emotional support during and after response briefings. So as folks are getting more information about the current status of the event, their loved ones, that can be really taking an emotional toll on victims and their families. And so they can be there as an emotional support. They can help them as they plan funerals and burials. Again, like it's another system that if you haven't had to plan one before, it's already very stressful. And so adding crime victimization on top of that makes it more stressful. So they can help them navigate the resources that are available, the process, all those things related to the funeral and burial services process. They can help support or provide staffing if there are ever site visits or memorial visits. And they can help coordinate property return, especially if you're talking about law enforcement-based or district attorney-based victim services agencies. That's a core part of their everyday work already. And so they can also help with that organization and process at these family assistance centers as well. So this is a quick video. We have a couple of videos just to provide some visual context. So many communities, and luckily the vast majority of communities don't often have to set up these types of centers. And so to really give you a visualization of what we're talking about, when we talk about family reception centers or family assistance centers, we have a couple of examples. This one is from the Gilroy Garlic Festival. And so we'll watch a quick video about that family assistance center.
As emotions are still running high in this tight-knit community of Gilroy, the district attorney's office has set up what's called a family assistance center right here behind us in Rucker Elementary School. That's set up designed to help anyone who is at the Gilroy Garlic Festival Sunday night.
The people in Gilroy, in this community, are strong and resilient, but many of them could use some help.
While roadside memorials grow outside of the Garlic Festival entrance, Santa Clara County District Attorney Jeff Rosen teamed up with the American Red Cross, the FBI, and the county's behavioral health services to turn this elementary school into a safe zone for families affected by the Gilroy shooting.
It could be help filling out forms for different kinds of assistance. They may need a counselor to speak with. And that's why we're here.
From grief counselors, emotional support, help filing claims for state funds, for medical or counseling bills, and other assistance for victims and their families. They're also providing referrals to other agencies or providers for medical and counseling needs. About a dozen people have come through so far.
We have people walking in different stages, and that's a completely normal feeling to have. There is no right way to respond to a tragedy like this. People grieve and cope in different ways, and we support that. So we just want people to know that there is resources and people to talk to that are available.
And to help people warm up to the idea of getting help here, they will also have support dogs like Namaste on hand all week. She's used in court and during tough interviews over in Monterey County.
And it's very difficult to sometimes in a difficult situation when you're interviewing children and adults and when they're in court to gain their trust and sometimes cooperation. But you walk in with a dog and immediately you've won half the battle.
This family assistance center is open every day this week through Friday. They are open at 9 in the morning up until 10 at night.
So we briefly touched on this earlier, but Victim Services has mutual aid availability. So every community is limited in the number of victim advocates that they have intra-community. But Victim Services agencies can call on their partner agencies across a region or across a state to come and provide ongoing assistance. And as we mentioned earlier, many of our federal partners also have victim specialists that can be called in to provide additional support if needed on site for these events. So the mutual aid, we talk about mutual aid with disasters and with emergency management. That same type of mutual aid is available for Victim Services. And they can also partner with agencies that provide disaster mental health care, spiritual care, really bringing in those additional support systems that may be useful on scene. And they already have those existing relationships, which can help ease the process of bringing them into the fold to respond to these mass violence events. And so we'll have one more video, and this is a video from the Las Vegas Route 91 shooting. And this really exemplifies what we talked about earlier, where there were many victim services agencies from across multiple states that came to Las Vegas to provide support to the large number of victims and witnesses and family members that were impacted by that crime. And so this is a much larger family assistance center, but it's a great second example to really think through the types of services and resources that your community members might need so that you can start thinking about the types of agencies that your law enforcement office wants to start building relationships with.
Now we have this report from Marissa Keniston.
This is structured to be a very nurturing, supportive, and I think healing place.
Flowers and tissues can be seen on the tables of what officials are calling a one-stop shop for anybody who needs help. The Family Assistance Center at the Las Vegas Convention Center was first set up to assist the families of those who were killed in Sunday's shooting. Now they're opening their doors to survivors and their families. It's filled with booths offering help, everything from Airbnb to the FBI, and personal items left behind will start rolling in the next couple days. It's something the city and first responders never thought they'd have to put together. But cities who have suffered through other mass shootings, including San Bernardino and Orlando, immediately flew in to help set up the Assistance Center.
We joined a group we never wanted to join, communities that have faced a tragedy like this. And there's a responsibility to make sure that the next community receives the benefit of your experiences.
Now, these doors will be open every day from 9 to 7 until further notice for the victims, survivors, and their families. Marissa Keniston, 13 Action News.
So what's important for law enforcement to know about what victim services agencies would need in the aftermath from law enforcement to appropriately respond to the needs of victims and survivors on scene? They'll need information about any of the logistics. So, what's happening, when's it happening, all of that information that's really helpful for them to start thinking through their planning process, their staffing, the things that they'll need to know on the back end to really support and respond appropriately to what they're being called upon to assist with. Information and other available services, that's incredibly useful if they have a layout of what's happening and what's to be expected, and what role they really need to play when they respond. Timing of new information. So again, because they're often building the close relationships with the victims and the survivors, as new information is rolling out, as it's going to be shared publicly, being privy to that information so that they can help relay that, so they can help bring folks in to be there for family briefings, to get that information in a timely fashion so that they're not caught off guard if something changes and they weren't made aware of it, so that they could provide the adequate support to the friends, the family, the loved ones of those folks that they're supporting. And again, information about the briefings. So information sharing with victims and loved ones before it's going to be made public, just making sure that those folks, the loved ones, the friends, the family, the direct victims have access to that information before it hits social media, before it hits the news. And then the specific details that are typically only made available to victims and families. And so making sure that they have as much information as they can so that they can, again, provide that adequate and needed support and service to those friends and family, and they have as much information as possible to provide the best services that they possibly can. And so now I'm going to hand the presentation off over to Mitch Cunningham, who's going to talk about relationships and planning.
Thank you, Paige. So as we see, there is so much to do when it comes to planning and preparing for these events. We know that they can be hugely demanding. We know about the impacts, the psychological, the traumatic impacts that they have on our staff, on the people that we're working with. And so as Paige has outlined for us, we have this tremendous resource that we can now call upon. In some cases we have in different ways, but now they play an essential role to meet the needs of these victims who are working through some very traumatic, very tragic circumstances. And by developing these relationships with victim services and calling upon these resources, we can be better ensured that these folks struggling through these experiences will be as best served as possible. So let me introduce you to Ryan Glassford. He currently is a deputy fire chief of Clark County, Nevada. He also was present and was the Family Assistance Center director during that tragic Las Vegas Musical Festival event. So let's hear from the lessons that Ryan Glassford can teach us about events like this.
We had a Family Assistance Center response plan. It was a document about 2 inches thick. And in the first hour, when it was hitting the fan, when I got here, it was dropped in my lap and I skimmed through it in about 30 seconds and went, none of this is relevant to what I'm dealing with right now. Mm-hmm. And it's the problem of having people who haven't done this write your plan. The importance of having somebody with the background and the real world experience of not just a simulated exercise, but things that have actually happened in our society, writing your plan is pivotal to your success, in my opinion. The truth of the matter is that you as a leader, you only know what you know. And if you don't surround yourself with people that are good at a whole bunch of things that you're not good at, you're in trouble. One of the things that I really work hard at is recognizing greatness in other people and recognizing that they have skill sets that I don't. And man, when I see people who are experts at their gig, I want to grab them and I want to hold them right next to me because they have it and I don't. I can help facilitate a whole bunch of their ideas just because of the rank structure that I'm in, but I don't know some of those things. You have to be able to do that here because no matter how many tabletops you've ran, no matter how many manuals you've went through, that these events are so dynamic. Having somebody around who can tell you and show you and you can listen to and you know you're getting wise counsel is worth its weight in gold. So for me, it was about building the right team, right? Good to great. Get the right people on the bus, put the right people in the right seats. And then once that happens, then you basically just got to get out of the way and watch the magic happen because these people know what to do and they're going to march forward. And usually they march forward and they're like, hey, let me tell you what I did.
So I'm glad you're convinced. I know I am. So what can we do? What should you do if either these resources aren't available or it's time to look at them in a new way? Now's the time to assess the resources that you have available to you and begin planning for the resources you will need to navigate this process going forward. And so there are county resources, state resources. You may find yourself availing yourself of a DA's office, victim services employees. Your hospital has begun planning for these types of events and may offer opportunities for you to work with. But the way to look at it is really short term, right? What are we going to do tomorrow? What do we need immediately? But then begin thinking about planning long term, which is typically a 3 to 5 year plan, and begin setting up, establishing task forces, et cetera, so that you can set the policies, the plans, begin building those structures that you will call upon when these events take place. So let's rejoin Tim Murphy again to tell us about his experiences in navigating in these situations.
But the trust thing, I think there's any opportunity we can get to get our advocates working with cops outside of what they normally do. So here, advocates work with the law enforcement, like I said, kind of show them where they need to go, help them navigate whatever. But it's sort of, it's in the workplace. It's that setting. So what I would encourage, and we do some of this here, and I'm sure other offices do it and probably do it better than we do, is get advocates out to do some shift trainings at police departments in your jurisdiction or sheriff's offices or whatever. Get out there to do some trainings. Because that'll not only open the door in terms of educating law enforcement as to what victim advocates do, but it also helps that relationship. Right now, it's not a stranger walking up to your chaotic scene saying, "I'm here to help." It's someone, "Oh, hey, that's Stephanie. She was here training us about elder abuse scams or domestic violence or strangulation." That kind of thing. And same thing in reverse. That advocate knows, hey, there was a lot of faces and a lot of uniforms and all that looked the same, but I remember this person because they're the one who introduced me to this shift briefing or whatever. There again, that starts building that trust, because you cannot build that trust, like you said, in that moment of chaos out in the middle of the night or whatever. So I don't know if that answered your question. I think I dovetailed it. I apologize, but it's just so important to have those the relationships ahead of time are so critical. And if all you can do is manage establishing that relationship between like the lead and the lead at the law enforcement or your supervisor level to supervisor level or whatever, that's a starting point. You have to start somewhere. And there's some opportunities there through different trainings that law enforcement trains a lot. And so I think advocacy, the supervision and management of advocacy, that's an inroad right there. Offer to help at those trainings or be part of those trainings. And I can go into more detail on that, on some ideas there, but that trust is so important.
So as we think about victim services, as they become a normal, traditional, expected part of our policies and procedures, I think back to my own experience, which was how our agency, Montgomery County, Maryland, reacted to a change in philosophy after Columbine. As you know, police officers' expectations were in an event like this, they certainly weren't prepared to take on active shooter responsibilities. In fact, their expectations, their policies and procedures said to isolate and contain. So we had a lieutenant who went to Columbine in the aftermath, took back lessons learned, and then rejoined our agency to teach us how to change our agency culture and reinstitute or institute these policies and procedures that we would be calling upon in the future. And we began doing exercises and drills to really stress test, to really examine how our staff, how our officers, how our command structures work if we would experience a similar event. And it was very, very revealing. We exposed a lot of policy gaps, inadequacies in some of the leadership that our first line supervisors were engaged in. And so those exercises, those drills were absolutely essential in helping us transition from a pre-Columbine mentality into a post-Columbine mentality. So as you begin this process or continue this process to prepare your agency, to evolve your agency to handle incidents, events like this, we have a lot of resources that you can see that will help you identify the policies you wish to institute. You will see drills and exercises that you can establish in your own agency. And the key to that is bringing in all those partners. We mentioned previously those relationships and those partnerships so that we understand how they'll react when we call upon them to to begin supporting us and supporting the community in while one of these incidents is underway. So typically, our expectations, our self-expectations when we're responding to and managing through these incidents are, as you can see, incident stabilization. We want to contain the incident. We don't want it getting worse. We want to minimize the impacts to the community, whether it's a natural disaster or, in these cases, mass violence or domestic terrorism. We're trying to limit the impacts that these incidents have. Additionally, saving lives. We're doing everything we can to prevent this incident having more impacts into the community. And then, of course, property conservation, right? We're doing the best we can to limit the impacts in the community, on people, and making sure that it doesn't get worse. However, what we now are saying is think about this incident more broadly. Think about the incident and its impacts on victims, of course, not only in the short term, but in the long term. And now, as we look at our ICS model, and we'll talk about that in a second, we've built in to our ICS model, which everyone, every police agency, all 18,000 of them have been trained in. You will see that this is a specific expectation, a specific role that is played by victim services under operations. You'll see that in a second, so that we're not only dealing with the short-term needs of these victims, but we're also thinking long-term. And I would take a moment to just talk about the research that we have now become aware of and how traumatic experiences have extremely damaging impacts to people years after these incidents take place. As Paige said, not only to the victims involved, but to the first responders that had to deal with this incident.
Paige, Mitch, and Ryan have given us a lot of great information about the many moving pieces and players involved in a mass violence incident. These responses are chaotic and emotionally challenging. Responders and law enforcement officers in particular are coming upon incredibly disturbing scenes and bearing witness to the horrific trauma of the victims and their families as they experience one of the most challenging times of their lives. There simply is no doubt that these events have an impact on us. As the quote says, the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. ICP TTA has put together an entire training on vicarious trauma for responders to mass violence incidents that will be on our website by fall of 2022. I would strongly encourage you to take a look at this recorded instruction when it's posted for more detailed information. But as a short preview, one of the best things we can do for our personnel is to ensure they are trained and prepared for the situations we ask them to respond to. Part of this, as Ryan said, involves putting the right people in the right places and watching the magic happen. As Paige talked about, victim services professionals training includes guidance on meeting the needs of victims and families as they receive information about the incident and their loved ones, and getting connected to things like long-term behavioral health services, compensation, and memorials, just to name a few. Additionally, victim services professionals are trained to provide all of this support while maintaining emotional boundaries. Mass violence incidents are going to be challenging for law enforcement. They are the nightmare scenario for any community, but we don't want these incidents to be more devastating than they must be. One of the best ways we can care for people is by allowing victim services professionals to do what they have been trained to do while we do what we have been trained to do.
Ryan is going to join us again and provide us with a little bit more insight on how he and others cared for themselves when these types of events have occurred.
The emotional toll. Yeah, look, if I knew that, I'd be rich, you know, on how to take care of people's emotions. It's going to be a little different, a little unique for everybody. But you got to make sure we, as the leaders now, we have to make sure that we're providing care for our people in multiple ways. Because what works for one doesn't work for two, might not work for three. And I saw creativity in how we took care of our people everywhere. They did yoga sessions at the coroner's office for weeks after this. And I was like, yoga? Who's going to do yoga, especially at the coroner's office? That's gross. That worked for a lot of people. I mean, that truly worked for a lot of people. Me, not a chance in the world you're catching me at yoga. No. But there are people who swear by that and that happened. And the fact that we offered that was brilliant, right? I joke about it now because, the vision of me in some yoga pants on a mat is just kind of funny. But other people, that was their jam, and that really helped them. Man, I watched people buy animals that they never had before, and all of a sudden they became dog walkers. And I watched people join into different groups that they didn't used to be in before, so they could go and explain their instances. I actually watched people in our department utilize our employee assistance program to go get help and speak to people because they knew that what they saw could adversely affect them down the road a little bit, even though they felt fine now. I think all those things are pivotal. And the fact that we offered a blanket of things to try to meet all people's needs, I think those are big deals, and those will pay dividends for my department for years to come.
So a lot of this presentation is about what we're hoping you're going to do in your local communities, but we want to let you know that there are some models that have happened where we've seen an integration specifically around mass violence response or domestic terrorism incident planning between local law enforcement and victim services divisions. And so I was very lucky to be a part of a pilot program in California. So initially in 2018, San Francisco started, and then it eventually turned into a statewide program where every district attorney's office in California has a victim witness division. And because across California, unfortunately, there had been so many mass violence incidences. There was the San Bernardino shooting. There have been shootings, the Gilroy Garlic Festival. There have been, unfortunately, just a number of incidents that have happened. And at the time, victim services divisions in DA's offices were not prepared. They did not have the relationships. They did not have the training. They did not have the, ability to transition their day-to-day work, which is primarily court-based, into responding to these mass violence incidences. And at the same time, law enforcement had no idea, what victim services could do. They didn't know what role they played. And so in those responses that they were called into, victim services, they kind of fumbled through and they made it work the best they could. But the statewide agency, Cal OES, funds both emergency management and funds the victim services agencies in California. And so they released money to actually build out purposeful partnerships where victim services divisions reached out, built proactive relationships with their local law enforcement. And that started in 2018. And what we've seen since then is there's been a real streamlining of when these events have unfortunately happened, the quickness and the nimbleness that can happen between law enforcement when they need to call in their victim services components in their communities. And so we've seen these instances. We saw the video from the Gilroy Garlic Festival shooting earlier, because they had been building those relationships, because they had been meeting already and talking through their roles and responsibilities and really talking through what would it look like if something like this happened in our county. When that incident happened, everyone pretty much knew what to do. Law enforcement knew that they could call upon the district attorney's office. The district attorney's office knew how to establish that family assistance center and could really take that key role in making sure that those victims and witnesses had support so that law enforcement could really focus on the work that they had to do on the operations and investigative side. And so we've luckily seen this happening. It's happening in more and more communities, and through ICP TTAC, it's happening a lot more luckily. So if it is a resource that you're interested in bringing to your community, I think Tara would be a great point of contact. You can always reach out to see if this would be something that your community wants to really invest more in. And if your department wants to dip their toes a little bit more, there is a great resource. I'm one of the consultants for the ICP TTAC group, and this group came and did a presentation for the group I'm working with, but there's a great resource that's available that I'll toss to Tara to tell you more about.
Sure. So we have a case study about the Aurora theater shooting that happened in 2012. And it is a case study that we have 3 of our subject matter experts present, and they present the tactical operations alongside the victim services operations and the communications operations. And they follow the timeline from the moment of the shooting through all of the stages of victim care, and what are the components that are being managed by each of those, and how are they connecting. So it's a great case study. It is done live, so we can do it via Zoom. And once we are able to travel, we can do it in person. And we are also developing one with the same format from the Las Vegas Harvest Festival shooting. So you would just call the program, and that contact information will happen at the end of this. Thanks, Paige.
Great, thanks, Tara. And it's a really phenomenal presentation, so I'd highly recommend it if your agency is interested in learning more. All right, so I'm going to pass it back over to Mitch to talk about the role of law enforcement.
Thanks, Paige. So as we identify an incident, as we're called to respond to an incident, or a 911 call, we're notified that one of these types of mass casualty, mass violence incident, or domestic terrorism is now occurred, and we are now responding. Of course, the staging area becomes the central point of focus, at least initially. And that's where all of the resources have been trained to go to. And it can be somewhat chaotic, but that's where we begin to grapple with what we're dealing with. And we have command staff arriving. We have different folks that will be taking on individualized roles to respond to the individual components and expectations that we have identified that now need to be managed. It's a very key place where now, as we think about victim services, it becomes a responsibility for us to then decide at this staging area, where is victim services going to be? Where are those particular components, those pieces that we've learned about, et cetera, where are they going to be located? Who's going to be responsible? And how do they fit into our organizational structure that we are used to existing in? And here I'm, of course, talking about the ICS system. So what is likely unfamiliar to you and has been unfamiliar to me is the role of victim services in the very traditional organizational structure of ICS. So we have the very well-known operations, planning, logistics, and admin. Those are activated always in every ICS response incident. However, our victim assistance resources, this process that we're now integrating into what we're doing and how we're responding to these incidents, is under operations. So that means the operational manager will be making key assignments from the outset, which will decide who will be liaison to the victims assistance folks, what they will be needing. But what is I think particularly fortuitous to what we're now doing as we traditionalize, if you will, victim assistance, it takes a load of responsibility off their shoulders. In the past, we have attempted to do the best we can with the victims as they're arriving, as we see them fearfully wondering, is my loved one involved in this incident? Now we have a process. We have a component structure that can now handle their needs, handle their concerns in a very effective and it was done with expertise. This is, as Paige has told us, we've kind of gone into various specific detail about all of the skill sets, all of the expertise they have. That's now offloaded from our responsibilities, other than liaisoning with them, to the folks who can do it best. For next slide, and we'll talk specifically what this looks like under ICS. So there you see operations. And of course, with operations, there'll be a number of different boxes and responsibilities, but here we have response and recovery. And on this slide, you'll see some entities you may or may not be familiar with. We've got a family reception center, a family assistance center, and then we have the Joint Family Support Operations Center, which is primarily focused on logistics. So all of these groups are now handling the victims. They're handling the victims' families. They're making sure that folks are accounted for, and not only immediately addressing these issues, but now they're starting to understand what is going to be expected long-term. And so we know that our victim assistance partners will not only be making sure that there's housing, that there's immediate supports, but we now get to see who's been involved and what are we going to be dealing with in the coming weeks, months, and years as the court cases continue. And folks are kind of re-traumatized as the court cases are underway. And with major incidents, we know those court cases don't happen the next year. They can go on for years, and appeals. And every time there's a court action, every time they get an email, every time they get a letter that they potentially are a witness in one of these cases, they're impacted. These are the folks that are going to minimize those impacts. Those impacts will be there, but they will be minimizing them. And they will be doing it with a high degree of expertise. So as we come to the end of our webinar here, and we begin thinking about the takeaways, about understanding where we are organizationally, really it begins with planning. We have to plan. We have to plan for these events. I think perhaps some folks may decide that an incident like this isn't coming to their jurisdiction, and I think history proves that in fact that's a terrible mistake to make. We know that in many cases, the folks who intentionally initiate these incidents are looking to exploit agencies, jurisdictions that they feel are less likely to be able to effectively respond. So every agency, whether it's large or small, needs to begin planning or stress test the planning that they've had. We mentioned the exercises and drills and their value to us as an organization, and to incorporating these new partners or testing the relationships with these existing partners. It's so important that we do that. And we've given you some ways and given you some resources that will help you do that. The game plan is, you can start with it by putting it on paper, but in the end, it's our responsibility to learn the best practices that have been developed for us up to this point. We know that we have devoted our lives and our careers to helping victims in whatever way we find them. In this case, we're talking about a lot of victims who will be changed by this tragic experience that they've involuntarily found themselves a part of. And it's up to us to make sure that we are doing the best we can for these folks, not only for the folks that we are dealing with outside the organization, but as Dave so movingly talked about, these insidious traumatic impacts that happen our own staff, who by virtue of giving of themselves and caring for folks that they have come in contact are also impacted. So we have a dual role here. It starts with planning and building those relationships so we can call upon each other when facing and managing through one of these incidents.
As we come to the end of our webinar, I want to thank my fellow presenters for bringing their expertise to the subject, and thank you for watching this recording. I also want to take a minute to talk a little bit about how you can get additional services through ICP TTA for your community if you're interested. First thing to know is if you really enjoyed this webinar and you have additional questions about integrating law enforcement and victim services and want to talk to the subject matter experts you've met today, we would be happy to arrange that for you. On your screen, you see a phone number and email address to contact us to set something up. In addition to requesting assistance on the topic, you can also apply for your community to become a site to receive in-depth assistance developing a plan involving all 16 of our best practices. You can access the application through the QR code on your screen by scanning it with your phone. You can also get the application by visiting our website. On our website, you will also find several resources and trainings related to each of the 16 best practices. We thank you for your time and look forward to hearing from you. Thank you again.